Welcome to Tea and Teaching, the educational podcast you can listen to with a cup of tea. I'm Arthur Moore, and with me, as always, it's Mike Harrowell. Hi, Mike.
Hello, Arthur. Everything good?
Oh, it's fantastic, buddy. The sun is shining. We've all had a lovely day. How are you today?
I'm good. I'm impressed. Pippa came back for a third episode. We didn't
I
scare her
know.
off.
It's exciting. And that's because we're continuing, Mike, our chat about processing times in education, what it means for us as teachers and people who work in schools. So in episode 1, we had a lovely chat with Pippa about what is processing time? What do we all need to know? In the last episode, part 2, we spoke about what it means for our classrooms and some strategies that we can do there. But in this episode, we are going to be talking about neurodiverse students and kind of what we can do to support them, specifically focusing on processing time, as that's kind of what we've been talking about. And it's lucky, Mike, that I can welcome back, as you said, Dr. Pippa Busch. Pippa, welcome back to Tea and Teaching.
Thank you very much. Having me for a third time. I'm very excited.
It's our absolute pleasure to have you back on the pod. So I think before we kind of dive into this conversation, Pippa, we should really kind of define what we mean by neurodiversity. It's a term that we read a lot about, we hear a lot in education, but can you give us kind of a bit of a definition of what we mean by that in education?
Yeah, so neurodiversity it's the neurological differences and natural variations in the brain. And so some conditions that are under the umbrella of neurodiversity, I think the top 2 everyone thinks of is autism and ADHD, but there's so many more as well. So dyslexia, dyspraxia, dyscalculia, dysgraphia, that all of that group sits under it. We've got any learning disability sits under that umbrella as well. So specific learning disability like dyslexia or more generalized learning disabilities, things like Tourette's, anxiety, epilepsy, OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder. All these things are in the classroom. There's so many children, especially recently, that are being more aware of their difficulties and how to express and support them. It's happening in every classroom, and it's not just about autism and ADHD. It covers a huge wide variety of issues, and it's really interesting then speaking about processing times, because what supports one group might not support another group, and it's just so individual.
Yeah, we're going to try and do that ridiculous thing by taking this huge umbrella we just spoke about and talking about specific examples and strategies. And as you said there, like when we talk about neurodiversity, it's like this huge umbrella and so many things come under it. But is there any kind of relation we can see to processing time? Is there any commonality between them, or is it completely different for every student with every kind of term you've mentioned there?
I think it's completely different. However, I think allowing more time is a very good strategy to solve a lot of those problems. So even though they're for different reasons, the strategy still works of just allowing that little bit more time.
And Mike, I'm interested to ask you, because I think we once worked out you were teaching when I was still at school. I think we worked that out once. Is this something that in your kind of teaching career, because that you hear a lot more of, or is it just because we're more aware of it, because we're speaking about, like, when I was at school, I don't remember kind of these terms being used and all kind of strategies that were in place. But I don't know, maybe that's just because I was a student at the time, but you were teaching at that time, Mike. So how's the world changed in education?
Oh, you're lucky we're on a virtual podcast. When I was at school, I don't remember any of these terms being used. You were set for things, and you had the clever kids and you had the slower kids. Like, I guess that's how we saw it. Whether teachers were using these phrases, I don't know. I know when we trained, we talked about specific examples, but I definitely think they are more well known now. Teachers are more educated in terms of the diversity of needs within the classroom, and things like one-page profiles can really help in terms of making teachers aware in a few bullet points how they can cater to the needs of each individual student. I know ours come up really easily on our registers. You can just hover over a student and it comes up a couple of bullet points about specific strategies you can do to help them with things like processing time. It definitely makes teaching more challenging now, but it also, the challenge is how individualized can I make my classroom, and can I suit my learning to every child in the classroom. And that's a fun challenge, I think, as a teacher, is thinking, right, I want to do these activities. What am I going to have to do? What reasonable adjustments do I have to put in place for this student and that student? And how might that look in each activity? I think that's, we talked in episode 2, Pippa, you mentioned about the art of teaching. And I definitely think that's the art of teaching, is working out, because we can all pick up a lesson plan and teach it, but making it suit the people in front of you, that's the art, I think.
So much, and keeping them engaged and successful is another thing, isn't it? So it's not just putting it to all the different boxes in the room, but also making that enjoyable, accessible, successful, and safe all at the same time. It's a huge task.
So Pippa, is there anything I should know as a teacher when I'm kind of planning my sessions with some of the students we're kind of give examples of in mind? How much do I need to be reading up on kind of all these different kind of backgrounds that we've mentioned? Or should I be relying on their one plan? Should I be relying on kind of my experience of them? That's one thing I think is always interesting. We hear these plans and you hear teachers saying, oh, that's not my experience of that student in my subject. I'm just wondering, what do you work with these teachers and kind of these students? What do you do when those discussions are happening?
Yeah, I think it's a lot about the relationship actually between the pupil and the teacher. And I think it's really interesting because it tends to be a PE teacher that's their safe person in secondary school. It tends to be someone who is approachable, who they've got a nice relationship with, that can then challenge them and give them the prompts that they need, and they will be receptive to that as well. Because if the child's not receptive to the way you're teaching, then you're going to get their back up for some reason. So, for children with ADHD or people who can't focus very well or just need more movement breaks, for example, it's like the school environment doesn't suit them. And I often say to children I work with, life is kinder than school, because in life you get to figure out what you're good at and keep doing it. Whereas in school, you've got to go with the flow for that educational setting. So no, I think it's a lot of your experience, but I think that experience comes from your relationship with your pupils.
When we were speaking earlier, you said it was just essentially giving more time is a really good idea.
Yeah.
So how can we spoke about in episode 2 about just giving all our students more time. We spoke about some strategies and techniques for that. But do you have anything that you could say when you're working with students who are neurodiverse, like you should be doing this? Or is it just a simple case of instead of giving 3 seconds, I give 4 seconds?
No, so it is different. So, for example, a child with anxiety, I often get asked, should we not be cold calling children with anxiety? If they say, oh, miss, you're not allowed to ask me to talk in front of the class. And I'm sorry, I don't like that approach. My approach is then, okay, why is that? What can we do to help? So I'm going to come and ask you a question in a bit. What do you think the answer is? Yes, that's right. You've got the right answer. And I'm going to ask you to say that in front of the class. So you're framing everything so that the anxiety of them getting it wrong and the anxiety of their peers' response to that, you diminish that a little bit, and then you give them that success. So I think there's a lot of strategies for anxiety, for example, where you can limit the fear and give them still that experience and that success. But then, for example, so those children that struggle to focus, it's interesting because I get a lot of children at my clinic that think they've got ADHD, and when we do some cognitive profiling on them, they've actually in the 99th percentile for processing speed. So they've got very low verbal skills, for example, but a really fast way of thinking. And so that looks in the classroom like impulsivity. That looks that they're interrupting you. And what actually is happening is their brain's working really fast, but they can't get the words out to support that. And that must be so frustrating for them. So I think it's a lot to do with your judgment. It's a lot to do with your relationship, but it's also a lot to kind of understand where their strengths lie, which is really easy, isn't it?
I know I spoke earlier in terms of understanding each individual student, but a rising tide raises all boats, doesn't it? It's good teaching will help everyone. And the strategies you talked about there, Pippa, like front loading when you talk to a student, that's a really good answer. I'm going to ask you to share that with the whole class. That works whether that student's got a neurodiversity need or not. That's going to help
Yeah.
every single student in your class. So yes, I think we need to adapt our practices for the students in front of us. But actually, I think one of the best things to help any student with any kind of diverse need is fundamentally good teaching. It's planning what you're going to do and be really, really premeditated about how you're going to go about your practice within your classroom.
Yeah. And I think you can plan in naturally as well. So, for example, the children that need more movement breaks, just to keep their brain to focus on things, like getting them to hand out the books, getting them to take a message somewhere, getting them to help set up the equipment, whatever it is, it can look really natural. And you know which children that's going to benefit and which children it's not going to benefit. Because some children, if you interrupt their train of thought, once they've got into like a hyper focus, that's not going to help them, but it is going to help other children. So again, it's all about getting to know the kids and your professional judgment on that, and backing yourself as well, because you're going to get it wrong at times, and that's totally okay. One of my favorite things with kids is when one of the strategies I have about teaching emotions is I label it for them and go, oh, you look really cross. And I love it when I get it wrong, because they go, oh, cross you, or whatever it is. They tell me how wrong I am, and I love it. So I think it's not hard to get things wrong, and everyone's going to get things wrong. And again, we're just going back to that, setting the environment to allow that time to teach everyone how to be tolerant and disagree nicely and work on different strengths. And I think also to come to that is having groupings that have lots of different levels in them. I think that's a really effective strategy. It's not a very comfortable strategy for teachers, but it's a very effective strategy for learners. Have you found that in your teaching, guys?
Maths, I find maths really difficult when you get students who have either done it before and got it, or students that haven't, because it's really hard to bridge that gap. It's maybe not. And my wife, we've had this discussion, I'll put the word, many times. So like sometimes in some other subjects, you can have, because there's not right or wrong, there's a discussion in the middle, and you can have that discussion. Where sometimes for maths, there's a student goes, I can do trigonometry and I cannot yet do trigonometry. And it's really hard to bridge that gap. And it comes back to what, Mike, you spoke a lot about in episode 2, which is like my planning beforehand, which links to what you're saying this episode, planning, Pippa, of like planning with my students in mind. So I know this student might take that extra bit of time to learn this new thing. I know these students maybe processing even quicker. They might both be neurodiverse, and I can just use my teaching, like the art of teaching, my experience, to kind of find a ground that works for everyone. And I think that brings back to what you were saying, Mike, just like everything we're saying here is not about like being a good teacher for neurodiverse students. This is just being a good teacher, and it just happens that some of your students have kind of got that neurodiversity. Mike, I'm interested, like, again, like you must find this a lot in P, and people mention that P is often kind of that safe space for a lot of students, but you must have just students who are just like I have students who are disengaged with maths. You must have students who are disengaged with PE, but it's a physical subject. So I'm interested in how you kind of breach that gap with those students in your subject area.
Yeah, it's an interesting subject where sometimes like their one-page profile just does not apply to my subject. Like sometimes the students with slower processing speeds, that might be an auditory processing speed. And actually, if I ask them to do something and I demonstrate it to them physically, that they have to do it physically, they pick it up quicker than anyone else. So it's a really weird subject where we read through all the diverse needs of the students in front of us, and then you get them in a sports hall, and it looks totally different in practice. And you actually have to try and work out there, like, actually, I've got a student who has a typical processing speed, is flying in English, maths and science, but physically is really struggling to even hit a shuttlecock with a badminton racket. Yeah, it goes back to having those relationships, understanding the students in front of you. And the thing I look for is, and we've all seen it, the trainee teacher, I have planned this lesson. I will teach this lesson how I've planned this lesson. And it is a one-page lesson, and one page doesn't fit all. And the best lessons you watch are multi-paced. And the teacher is not teaching 3 different lessons at once. This is not differentiation. This is not different color worksheets, different people working on different things at different times. This is scaffolding, where everyone's working on the same task. We're working at different paces. And the teacher has created an environment where that's okay, but we're all working towards the same goal. that's the skillful teachers. That's the lessons you stand in and go, wow, this is everything these students need this lesson to be.
You're so right, Mike, with this idea of scaffolding, because like sometimes helping a student with their processing time, and it's not just giving them more time. It might be they've got little prompts on their desk, or in the back of their book, they've got their glossary. Did this a lot for maths. Like, so when they don't know a word, like it's already there in their book, they've got their little phrase. Like, so I'm not giving them extra time, but I'm taking away time for them to process something else. So they've got more process time to think about the question. In maths, I often find, like you asked me earlier, Pippa, like in my subject, that's how I sometimes have to do it. So I don't think like those students who could do trig and can't do trig, well, it might be the students who can't do trig, I give them the first half of the question so they can get into the question, or I tell them what the answer is and they have to work backwards. And I think that's where really good teachers, you see them doing this naturally all the time because they just know their students in their subject area. And Mike, you were saying like the students who come out to you, like, and you're being told X, Y, Z about them. Exactly the same for maths. I get students who are like, they're really going to struggle. They can't sit and focus, and they love it. They're just in that moment, and it's a subject that connects with them. And we'll all know this with our subjects. Mike, you're going to jump in there.
The mad thing about being a PE teacher or having been a PE teacher is you get a student in a practical subject and you learn how to teach them. And then at GCSE and A level, they suddenly come to you in a classroom and you've got a theory aspect to teach, and you have to teach that child in a totally different way. And you see that student through two totally different lenses, whether it's their academic work or their practical work. And that's a real tough one to kind of conquer, because you think, well, you pick up everything I ever asked you to do practically, and we get into a classroom and suddenly I'm having to give you those prompts and that scaffolding and that extra time. And that's a real odd insight that maybe other subjects don't necessarily get into students.
Never thought about that, Mike. Never thought about that with PE. Yeah, of course.
I'm here to broaden your mind, Arthur.
Every week.
Arthur, you said something there about the people that don't necessarily start a task very well. I had an example where, because of neurodiversity, this kid just couldn't get started. And so they would waste so much time trying to write the learning objective and get the date down. And this was a primary school example and trying to underline things. I gave them a date stamp. I just gave them a stamp where they go, that's done, now we can move on. And that was like transformational for their academic learning. It was just, there's not a blank page in front of you. You have already sorted and organised that aspect that was finding it difficult. And I think it kind of ties back to something we said in episode 1 about what is it you're trying to assess? Are you trying to assess this whole big picture? Do you actually just need to teach them a single thing and take the other demands and the overload away just so they can teach that? So you can teach that, they can learn it, and then they can start applying it in more complex settings. But you can't always learn something when there's so many other things going on.
It's definitely what people talk about teaching is like every day is different. And a lot of it is exactly the same and going in and doing the same stuff. But it's when we get these moments of like, for this student in this specific part of the subject that I love and I'm passionate about, I need to come back from an angle I haven't considered. And I think that's when you see, when you see really good teachers, they know with that student at that moment in that context, they need to come up from a different path. And you spoke about paths in episode 1, Pippa, of like just different between the input and the output. We all go different paths, and teachers get that as well. I just want my students to get to this point. They're starting at this point. Some might need a little break here. Some might need a little checkpoint here. Some student might go straight through. And that's where you see brilliant teachers. And often that's to do with experience and subject knowledge. Mike, I don't know if
I think it.
Yeah. Sorry, Pippa.
Sorry, I think it's to do with co-construction. So if you've got a strategy and they've got the thing that needs to be learned, and you've got to find a pathway together. And that's the art of it, isn't it? The science and the art coming together. I know it's not a very academic example, but this morning I had a boy who's got a phobia of dogs. And so we printed out different dogs and we tried to rank which was the scariest and which was the least scariest. And he put this one as least scary. And when I asked why, he went, because he's got a birthday hat on. So now one of the strategies is to sing happy birthday to all the dogs that go past him, because it makes them less scary, because he imagines them with the birthday hat on. And that is not something I went into the meeting this morning thinking I was going to say, but that co-constructing that path of here's a strategy how can we make that work for you is the key, I think. And that's really difficult. And that's why it comes down to experience and professional judgment and getting it wrong sometimes. Like, you're going to get it wrong. Like, if I suggest singing happy birthday to dogs to someone else, it's not going to work. But just him visualizing these birthday hats on dogs makes them less scary.
I think if I can kind of give one more bit of advice based on my many years of experience, Alpha, it would be that when you co-construct those and that you're successful with it, is that you celebrate it. Because that's a real big thing for that student, is when they get that and they have that breakthrough moment. And that's what we're all in teaching for, that light bulb moment where we can just see the penny drop, and the child, you can almost see them fill with confidence. I did it, and I can do this next one, and actually celebrate those, even if it's just a high five and just like, well done, you're smashing it, keep going, because that confidence and that motivation will then just breed success.
This is like flirting. This is such good ways to build secure relationships. Is that, celebrating them, acknowledging it. It's really, really lovely to hear people say that. And it works.
Celebrate to yourself as well, Mike. Like, give yourself, like, make a point of saying, like, I did something really well today.
Like, just that one thing. I try and do one thing right a day, and maybe that could be it, Alpha.
It means you do 365 things right a year, buddy.
Well, I'm not in work all of those days.
Pippa, it's been such a delight having you on these 3 episodes talking about processing time. I hope, listeners, you've kind of come away with a bit more understanding about kind of what's going on and then what it means for you as a teacher in your classroom with your students. Pippa, I'm sure there's people who've listened to this being like, 2 of the people on the pod had no idea what they were talking about. But Pippa, man, I want to know more about her, what she does, how I can go and work with her. Pippa, where do people go to find out more about Dr. Pippa Busch?
Oh, thank you very much. I have just set up a website called thechildpsych.co.uk, and I offer lots of services there. So I work with schools, I do inset training, I do ELSA training, I do keynote speaking, I do autism assessments, I do lots and lots of things. And one of my primary reasons is to just support parents and families when I want to make psychological support accessible for anyone who needs it. So I go to the website of thechildpsych.co.uk and you'll get more information from me.
And we'll put all those links in the episode notes, listeners, so you can go away and click away and find more about Pippa. Let us know what you thought of these episodes on social media at T and Teaching, the letter T and Teaching. Get involved in conversation and just let's share some great ideas. And as Mike said, let's celebrate those successes that we have, because it's important that we do. Pippa, it's been an absolute pleasure having you on T and Teaching. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me. It's been great.
And Mike, what a pleasure it is to spend more time with you talking about teaching. We should do it again sometime.
You're welcome. I'm glad it was a pleasure for you.
And that's it. Nothing more. Nothing more, Mike. It was a pleasure for us. Listeners, thank you so much for joining us on these episodes of Tea and Teaching. We'll see you next time.